Good day and welcome to yet another Rand Swiss Weekly Wrap. As always, we'll be going over what happened in the last week and seeing how it's going to affect your investments going forward. The big event of the week was probably the Fed minutes being released. With regards to that, we saw that the Fed still is on the aggressive side in terms of fighting inflation, looking at somewhere between half a percent to 0.75% hike in the next meeting. This comes as we are anticipating US inflation numbers next week to show that US inflation has not yet peaked. So we're expecting still a number about 8.7%. It's quite a high number, especially when you consider the fact that their target rate is actually 2%. So if you imagine for us in South Africa, where our maximum rate is 6%, this would be like inflation that's 4 times plus higher than that. So we're talking 26% inflation rates in South Africa, which is, as you can imagine, an incredibly high level. But like I said, the Fed looks to be quite aggressive. That being said, it appears the market isn't quite believing some of the rhetoric the Fed's putting out there. US bond rates, for the 5 and 10 year, aren't quite pricing in the upper end of what the Fed is talking about in terms of raising interest rates. So the Fed basically has given us a plan, an idea as to what its maximum rate's going to be like, and the bond market seems to say, no, that's not going to happen. I personally also don't think it's going to happen, and I think that, quite frankly, the Fed is likely to look at, the kind of pain that's going to be caused in the economy by high interest rates, by the political backlash that's going to be caused. And as soon as we see inflation come down, say below 5% or so, which is probably going to happen, the Fed is going to kind of waver on its commitment and probably start looking to either pause its rate hiking initiatives or even start cutting back on interest rates. And the market is kind of believing the same thing at the moment. So yeah, I think that is something to be concerned about. Like I said, next week we have CPI. A couple of weeks later, on the 28th of July, we have the US GDP number for the second quarter, also a very important number. Now look, the first quarter GDP number for the US was negative, and inflation was reasonably high as well. If we have another disappointing number, may not have to be negative, the market could be in quite a dire situation. It's one thing to be basically fighting very high growth, because when you have inflation. So if you have an inflation rate that's very high, you have a high growth rate, you could say, okay, let's sacrifice some growth to get that inflation number under control. It's a very different thing to have negative growth and high inflation. That's stagflation, where you have no or little growth or negative growth, and then you have quite high inflation or above trend inflation. In that scenario, if you try and fight the inflation by cutting demand, you're basically cutting growth that's already negative, so you might cause even deeper recession, which is obviously something to be concerned about. The other news of the week, we had load shedding continue in South Africa that pushed the currency, to new, year plus lows against the US dollar. We hit 1680 plus to the dollar. Again, last week, for those that were on our newsletter service, you would have seen me issuing a warning about this. As soon as load shedding level 6 was announced, around was like about 1580, some change, 1580 to 1590. I basically issued a note saying that you should not, hesitate to try and move money as quickly as possible if you're looking to move money in the short term, because the rand was set to weaken quite dramatically. We've seen a 5-6% weakening in the week since I sent that note out. So, just a note, not just because I want to basically blow my own horn about how good my recommendation was, but also to make sure that you guys are on our newsletter service so that you can actually get access to some of the information that we give out. We do give out these kind of things not all the time, once in a while, and generally only when we see some significant news event that is going to be important for your investments. And so we do issue this emergency stuff. And this is that we also give you daily roundups of stuff. We give you weekly roundups of what happens in the market. It's quite a nice little service to be part of, and it's totally free. So get in contact with our guys and we'll add you onto it. But that being said, our load shedding hit level 6, which is obviously a very high level. We've done it once before. This week, we've gotten the number down a little bit. The hope is by the weekend we'll get it down to like level 4, level 2, and by next week we might be back to a non-load shedding period, or shocking as that's going to be. What caused this load shedding was some illegal strike action by Eskom workers. If you're in essential services, you're not allowed to strike. And these workers effectively not only were on strike, they were also using violence and intimidation to stop other workers from going to work, to stop production at some of these power plants. and that's basically pushed us to the level of load shedding we had right now. In addition, we are seeing that government really isn't able to do much about that. Look, normally you'd expect workers break the law, they get fired, they may even get arrested. In this case, what's happened is the government basically folded. They got a 7% rate wage increase. In addition to that, there's a talk of a possible another 15,000 rand once off sweetener to get these workers, in a position where they'll be happy again. And in addition, there isn't even talk about not basically following the no work, no pay principle. So workers that were basically striking will not get any sacrifice. They will not get any drop in earnings. They'll actually get an increase in earnings plus a once off sweetener for engaging in what was an illegal strike plus other illegal actions, including violence and intimidation. So until we get this load shedding situation under control in South Africa, our growth rate is going to be really, really constrained. I don't know, how exactly we can grow as a country without electricity supply being more stable and being more, abundant. That being said, I do think that this time was a little different. We've seen a lot of backlash against the government. The people are directly blaming government ministers. They are blaming the ANC for this particular event. The opposition DA party has obviously, jumped on this bandwagon. It could be a case of where this was bad enough that it forces government to do something about the load shedding situation. One of the things that I think is the best thing to do is to have this independent power producer, IPPs, on the system. Either can be renewable or non-renewable. That would make a huge difference, as it would allow, these independent power producers to take off some of the strain off the system. The power producers being independent also means that they are more likely to complete their jobs on time. If you look at some of these plants Eskom has built recently, well above budget, and in some cases, inoperable for the majority of the time because of bad or sloppy workmanship or sabotage, and who knows what's happening behind the scenes. So until we can get the electricity situation under control, it's another massive bottleneck for this country. We can't really grow very well. Also in news this week, we see commodity prices under great deal of pressure. Good concerned analyst Anthony Clark, who writes a bit of stuff for us, came out with a note where he talked about the fact that we are seeing some soft commodities, that's food and agricultural commodities, drop in price to levels that we saw before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It must be noted, however, that there is a bit of discrepancy around this. Yes, prices are lower on the main exchanges with regards to soft commodities, but those main exchanges are in the US. In Europe and other parts of the world, we are seeing a big differential in terms of pricing. The reason being is, of course, just because there's wheat that's cheap in the US doesn't mean you can get that to some other parts of the world at the same price. So we are seeing some price differential across different countries. And also, I do think that we mustn't just celebrate the fact that prices are falling. Why? Because commodity prices being lower means that the incentive to produce is also lower. At the same time, we are seeing input costs remain reasonably high. Gasoline in the US, petrol prices remain high, fertilizer prices remain, not at the highs, but reasonably high. That means that a farmer right now is facing the following outlook. The cost of producing his crops is quite high, but the chance of him getting a low price of the crops is also quite high. So if he basically spends the money right now, buys the fertilizer, buys the seeds, buys the fuel to plant his crop, when he eventually harvests it in, say, 3+ months' time, he may not get the kind of pricing that he's seeing right now in the market, maybe a much lower price, which could lead to a loss. So that's one of the bad things about what's happening right now. In addition to that, the number of places in the world that are experiencing drought is quite significant. Italy just announced a state of emergency around its drought. We do know, of course, there's drought in places like India, in the US, North America. That's also negatively affecting what's happening in the food sector. And finally, regarding food, there was an announcement recently that the Netherlands, the Dutch, are looking to curb the nitrogen emissions, which means to a large extent curbing a lot of production, especially around things like meat. This has been met with a lot of resistance by their government, by the farmers. There's been protests against the government. There's been, lots of direct action. There's videos out there of them spraying manure on government buildings and, driving tractors really fast. At the moment, this is the wrong thing to be doing. The Europeans look to have no concept of what's reasonable given current market conditions. The Dutch, besides being a small country, surprisingly enough, is the number 2 agricultural export in the world. Look, it's a bit distorted because they do a lot of processing in the country, and a lot of things like, for instance, tulips that have a high value per weight and so on. But that being said, they are the number 2 in the world after the US. And if they are doing things that are going to harm their food production, it's going to have a disproportionate effect on world food supply. So this is kind of similar to what happened when the Germans went and shut down the nuclear power plants right before the war, or are continuing not to basically look at reigniting or restarting those plants at the moment, despite the fact that they're going to be facing quite difficult energy dilemmas going into the future, and are likely to basically be in a very dire state come this winter when they need energy to heat their homes, etc. So another bit of bad news in the farming sector. And one last thing before I go, we started to see protest action happening in parts of the world. Like I said, because of the inflation that we're seeing at the moment, latest place to happen is in Ghana. There's been quite a bit of protesting happening there related to fuel prices mostly this time. But of course, food also plays a part in that as well. So expect to see more of this if my thesis about higher food prices, high inflation holds true, and we see the poorer parts of the world, the parts that these increases, resort to protest action to try and do something about the economic pain they are feeling. Okay. On that depressing note yet again, have a great weekend, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.